You know, some of my younger viewers may be surprised to hear this, but there was a time when doing a superhero movie was not only a risk, but they were considered to almost be box office poison. Even good films usually underperformed and weren't taken seriously, with the only successful franchises really being Superman and Batman. Superman, however, petered out, with each film making less money than its predecessor, and Batman and Robin, well, that destroyed the Batman series for quite some time. Marvel had yet to have a big hit with their superhero films, with their biggest hits being the science fiction-rooted Men in Black and the more horror-themed Blade. The X-Men film that came out in 2000 seemed to open the floodgates for Marvel, though, and suddenly we were getting Spider-Man, Daredevil, Hulk, Fantastic Four, Ghost Rider, and all sorts of other properties. And while the first X-Men film was good, it was fundamentally flawed in a lot of ways, and I felt that Spider-Man, that's where they really nailed it. What's ironic is that although Spider-Man was one of my favorite comic heroes when I was a kid, I felt that over the years Marvel just ruined the character. It's like after the character had been around for a while, the concept got kind of stale, but Marvel didn't know how in the ass to freshen things up. Always doing asinine things like drawn-out clone sagas, mystical reboots, and recently a satanic divorce storyline. Yeah, don't ask. But strangely enough, although I felt the character had been done to death and all but ruined, I really enjoyed the piss out of the movie. It takes certain liberties with the character's origin and a few elements of his powers and characters, but it all made sense in the context of the film. For example, instead of inventing complex mechanisms to shoot webs, which would have been the result of advanced chemistry thought of by a 16-year-old, they just included webs as part of his powers. That aspect was even introduced into the comics eventually, though they reversed that in a few years. Way to go, Marvel. They also streamlined the origin, eliminating the parts where Spider-Man becomes a successful entertainer and becomes full of himself. I think it's an important distinction, but they handled it well. In the comics, after proving himself at a wrestling match and winning a bunch of money, Spider-Man enjoys a lucrative career as a stage performer, and it gets to his head. When a robber runs past him, he declines the opportunity to use his powers for good, figuring it's not his problem. Later on, the same robber kills his Uncle Ben in a home invasion, devastating and humbling Spider-Man. From then on, he becomes a hero, to atone for his mistake, as well as to prevent any further pointless deaths. In the movie, Spider-Man's run-in with the robber is immediately after the wrestling match, and he doesn't not stop the guy because he's being an asshole, but rather because the wrestling promoter just cheated him out of the money he won, using a bullshit technicality to give him $100 rather than $3,000. Instead of the robber having to go all the way to Queens to rob the Parker home, he instead almost immediately shoots Uncle Ben in a carjacking, as Ben was waiting outside for Peter. There are other changes, but most of them serve to make Spider-Man work on film rather than as a monthly episodic ongoing story. The plot treats us to Spider-Man's origins, and another change is that they updated the old radioactive spider to a genetically enhanced one, which I thought was a nice touch. There's plenty of emphasis on what a loser Peter Parker is. He's the stereotypical awkward nerd who pretty much everybody picks on. After being bitten, he gains all the typical spider powers and generally makes an ass out of himself, though he does manage to successfully defend himself against bully Flash Thompson. Meanwhile, we're also treated to the origin of the villain, the Green Goblin. He's a rich industrialist named Norman Osborn who, in danger of losing an important weapons contract with the military, tries an experimental serum on himself which gives him enhanced strength and reflexes, but he suffers the side effects of insanity and a violent demeanor. The Goblin is played wonderfully by Willem Dafoe, who plays the whole thing off as multiple personality disorder. The scenes where he's talking to himself in the mirror are done really well. They sort of did the same thing in The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, with Gollum talking to his reflection, and that came out later in the same year. Weird, huh? The Goblin gets revenge on the board of directors that attempted to force him out of his company, as well as his rivals. Spider-Man attempts to intervene in the two battle. The Goblin reasons that Spider-Man is the only person who can stop him, so he tries to get him to join him, which doesn't really work out. Things get the most interesting when the Goblin figures out Spider-Man's identity and starts attacking his loved ones, accumulating in a vicious final battle that proves fatal for the Goblin. There were a lot of homages to classic Spider-Man stories, and I thought that as good as all the action and superhero stuff was, what really shined was the characters. All the secondary players really helped to make the movie. You got James Franco as Harry Osborn, Kirsten Dunst as Mary Jane Watson, and Rosemary Harris as Peter's Aunt May. The more subtle parts of the movie are what works best, especially considering what my gripes actually are. And yes, I do have some gripes. The biggest one is with the visual effects. They're mind-bogglingly bad for a major big-budget picture from 2002. A lot of times when Spider-Man is swinging around, he's CGI, and it's really, really obvious, especially that the character appears weightless and floaty. They fixed this for the sequels, but it's really distracting in this film. I also can't stand the Goblin's costume. I don't know what they were going for with that, but he looks like a villain more from the Power Rangers than Spider-Man. The movie doesn't have as many huge logic gaps as X-Men did. The only major one I noticed was that Peter's physique changes drastically when he gets his powers. He goes from being a scrawny nerd to a mini Charles Atlas, and it shocks me that neither his aunt nor any of his friends notice it. I mean, just a line like, "Hey, Peter, you been working out or something?" That would have waved that right away, but oh well. Despite this, the movie is still good. It's just definitely overpowered by Spider-Man 2, which was far superior in every way, and one of the best superhero movies ever until The Dark Knight came around. After that, Spider-Man 3 was probably the worst of the bunch, but it doesn't really suck. It's just one of those sequels that isn't really as bad as most people say, but it is the weak link here. They're currently working on a new one, which is a reboot, so, joy. Overall, Spider-Man is pretty damn good. It has the right mix of action and drama, good characterization, and respects the characters and plots, while changing enough to make it work on the big screen. I'll give Spider-Man an 8 out of a possible 10.